Business editor Owen Fairclough is here with markets nervous about Iran and the EU as well.
Yeah, I suspect one or two investors, Stuart, in Japan will be wondering how this country post-Fukushima is going to fuel itself now that the Japanese government has decided to reduce oil imports from Iran as part of showing a bit of solidarity, I should say, with the US and the EU over their embargo on Iranian oil supplies. The Nikkei finishing the day around 0.8% off. Also concerned really about inflation in China. Consumer prices up 4% in December. Going to worry investors this side of the world over whether this country is in for some sort of hard landing. That said, the Shanghai Composite was managing to find a few gains and is still trading as we speak.
OK, well, there are growing concerns over the chances of Greece getting its hands on a second bailout after the Christmas and New Year break. Negotiations are resuming over how much banks and other private investors should write off.
Yeah, this is the big question right now, particularly with hedge funds who are estimated to hold up to 80 billion euros worth of Greek debts. All of this is just one concern in the run-up to fresh negotiations and indeed fresh EU summits in the weeks to come on finding some sort of long-term and meaningful deal for Greece. Well, David Riley is the head of the sovereign debt group at Fitch Ratings. He joins us now from a Fitch conference here in Paris. David, good morning to you. Thank you very much for joining us here on the Business Show. As Stuart was saying, there's been a lot of talk in the last 24 hours or so about private sector involvement, particularly how hedge funds are coming to the fore in possibly not being willing to write off any more of their exposure to Greece. How do you see all this? Is this something that's absolutely critical for any sort of second bailout for this country?
Well, it's a vital precondition if Greece is to receive another 130 billion euros from the International Monetary Fund and from the European Union, that there is agreement reached with Greece's private creditors on writing down a large part of its private debt. Part of the problem is that the ECB is unwilling to allow its around about 45 billion of debt that it holds to be written down, which means that the private creditors, like the hedge funds, have to take an even bigger haircut, and they're reluctant to do so.
David, the Greek government itself is even reckoning it's going to go bust without this bailout. Do you agree with that assessment, do you think, in March?
Oh, well, they have a large debt repayment on the 20th of March of around about 14 billion euros. Without reaching agreement with its private creditors on restructuring and writing down some of its debt and then getting new funds from the IMF and EU, then we are going to have a disorderly default event in Greece. And that would be, I think, extremely worrying, not only for Greece, but that would have spillover effects over to the rest of Europe, and we'll start raising the prospect again of the potential exit of Greece from the euro. So I think it is vitally important that Greece, the private sector and European leaders come together to reach an agreement and put in place a new programme, after which we can then get a new government in Greece, which would then hopefully have the mandate to undertake the reforms that are necessary.
David, just give us a sense of how realistic this scenario is of Greece actually going bust, potentially in March, maybe exiting the euro, maybe even leaving the EU. Are you, for example, actively preparing for that sort of scenario? We read all the time about how companies, banks and so on are now doing just that.
It's still our judgment that ultimately an agreement will be reached, that we know that the spillover effects during the whole of this crisis from developments in Greece into the rest of Europe and in particular the Eurozone has been so virulent that we don't think we'll be allowed to get to that point. Ultimately, we think an agreement will be done, new money will be provided to Greece, and Greece will stay within the Eurozone. I think that's good ultimately in our judgment for Greece, and we think it's good ultimately for the future of the Eurozone.
And can you give us a figure essentially on what sort of PSI involvement we're looking at? Maybe as much as 90%. Is that a realistic figure? Is that something that these private investors are now going to have to grasp and have to contend with?
Well, we're not expecting a write-down of that scale. Our own estimates suggest that the write-down would be more in the order of around about 60%. I think one of the problems or challenges is to actually get everyone to participate in this exchange. And of course, what Europe's been trying to do is to say that this is somehow voluntary. So we want you to write down 60% or more of your claims on Greece, but at the same time, we want you to do it in a voluntary manner. And I think one of those two things may have to go. It might be a situation where ultimately investors and creditors to Greece aren't given any choice, and they will have to take a write-down. But again, that would then be a sort of reversal of the policy that Europe's been trying to pursue of saying that there will be no sovereign default within the Eurozone and no sovereign default by Greece.
David, just moving on to talk about France for a second. You're here in Paris for a Credit Outlook event. Your agency is a little bit more optimistic, isn't it, about this country than your competitors? Why is that?
Well, because we believe that the economic and financial fundamentals of France remain very strong and therefore warrant and justify its continuing AAA status from Fitch. That being said, France is politically, financially, economically very heavily invested in the success of the euro. And our concern has been that as the crisis has reached the gates of Rome, which marks a very profound intensification of the eurozone crisis, that does pose a lot of risks for France, both in terms of economic growth, as we're seeing, the economy has slowed down, in terms of the French budget, and the potential risk to the French state from having to provide additional support to other countries within the eurozone. And for that reason, we did change our outlook on the French AAA rating from stable to negative. But as I say, I think there's still a lot of strong aspects of the French economy. It's very sophisticated. It's actually more competitive, I think, than many people give it credit for. So we do think that with the measures that that the government's taken to try to reduce the budget deficit as well, that we feel still comfortable with our AAA rating on France.
But that said, David, you had even President Sarkozy and some of his key ministers shortly before Christmas kind of softening the ground for this. You had Sarkozy saying it wouldn't be that catastrophic if France was downgraded. And you get the impression that even the government is starting to price this in and try and soften up public opinion a little bit for a downgrade. So maybe are you out of step with what the government's thinking?
Well, I think there's. I think the government, in some respects, is right to say it's not the end of the world if you lose your AAA rating, and that is the case. It's not the end of the world. It's not the most important thing. We're just giving, as a rating agency, an opinion in terms of forward-looking opinion about relative creditworthiness. I think the other aspect is that there's three major rating agencies. Fitch is one of them. It may be that one of the other agencies has a different opinion on France, and so France is still at risk from a downgrade from one of the other agencies. As we've said in terms of Fitch, is that if there is an intensification of the Eurozone crisis, if, for example, we were discussing Greece, that crisis in Greece was to get worse and increase the pressure on countries like Spain and Italy, that in turn would generate pressure on France and the French financial sector, then even from Fitch, the French AAA rating would be at risk.
OK, David, many thanks indeed for joining us. We do appreciate your time. David Riley there from Fitch Ratings.
In fact, he was so good, I'm just going to mention the UK film industry very briefly, in fact, because it broke box office records in the UK last year. The King's Speech, both a commercially and critical smash, and the Prime Minister David Cameron wants more British-made films with a little bit more financial clout. His opponents there in the UK, though, saying he's threatening diversity in cinema. We'll have more on that story a little bit later on here on France 24. Owen, thanks very much. That's the business for now. Claire's here. Latest headlines after the break.